morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the Call for Community Solutions hosted by the Forbes Fund and GPNP. As you'll notice, different faces today for the call. Emily and Christine are out doing an organizational training, so I'll be stepping in. My name is Brianna Stalder, she, they pronouns, and I'm the Sustainability and Social Impact Manager here with the Forbes Funds. And Craig Mayer will be doing the GPNP policy update today for us, again, while Emily and Christine are away. We've been hosting these calls since March of 2020 as a way to share resources and provide a space for community members to connect while enhancing and understanding short and long-term community needs. Since then, we've hosted 5,672 meetings with over 48,000 participants. Quick objectives for today, and then the agenda again, just same agenda, different faces. And then our guest speaker today is Mary Jane from Global Wordsmiths. And before we kind of transition into Mary Jane's presentation and to learn a little bit more about the organization, I'm going to quickly kick things over to Dan from Involvement just to share a quick opportunity with the organization. So I'm going to stop my screen share and kick it over to Dan.
All right, thank you so much, Brianna. So, hi everyone, my name is Dan Little. I am the CEO of Involvement. We have a mission to enable businesses and organizations to get access to the resources they need to make a difference without using conventional money. And we are hosting an event in tandem with Reimagine Jobs, which is a climate reality project, GAGI, which is Green Artists and Green Innovators, and New Sun Rising. It's called Solar Punk Future. For those of you who may not be familiar with solar punk is sort of a rejection of the cyberpunk vision of the future, where everything is sort of dystopian and taken over by tech and AI and that sort of thing, where solar punk is about appropriate use technology, about us working with nature and finding a solution that finding a future that benefits all of us. And so we're hosting this event May 29th, coming up quickly here in 10 days, from 1 to 6 p.m. at the David L. Lawrence Convention Center. I have a little, let me share my screen here. You can visit and register. We encourage everybody to register. There are a couple spaces for tables open. If you folks would like to table, you can contact Josephine Gingrich and I can share that information with you after this announcement here. But encourage you to register. We also encourage you to explore our Solar Punk Pledge. Sorry, I can't talk this morning. And that's dealing with issues around the environment and sustainability and encouraging people to take action on those. And so that is pretty much, I have a couple of photos here just to show like some of the programming. We also have programming within this event. Wasn't able to find 2024 program, but 2023 we had the New Sun Rising Give Awards out. We had our keynote speaker was Ecotone Renewables last year. It was Involvement, and we have a bunch of different programming and a bunch of different music and art events. And there's also going to be job tabling. So if anybody's looking to make a move, about 50% of the tables will have active and open positioning for jobs. So I encourage you to join, sign up, and hopefully I'll see you on May 29th.
Thanks so much, Jen. And if you could drop registration link in the chat and then any contact information in case folks had any follow-up questions or just general event questions, that would be helpful. Thank you so much. Sorry, pull the PowerPoint back up here. The Forbes Funds operates under dual frameworks, the UN SDGs and the social determinants of health. We also work around the 8 returns model, which guides us on how we measure the success or returns on various types of investments and the demonstration of our strong collaboration throughout the ecosystem. And then during the call, to better connect with everyone and to be a little more engaging, if you could turn your cameras on, please. Don't feel obligated if you're driving in transit, in commuting. But if you're just chilling at home, have your morning coffee and can kind of just be a little more engaging face to face. Make it, while we're in these Brady Bunch boxes, just a little more friendly during this hour. And then at the end of the call, there'll be a poll that really helps kind of help guide and shape these calls. Some folks, there's an open-ended question at the end if there's any sort of speaker or topic that you'd like to hear from or about. Your feedback is really critical in these moments for this Monday call. So transitioning into our speaker this morning, Mary Jane is the founder and CEO of Global Wordsmiths. Sorry, move my Zoom box here. Um, uh, she serves on the board of directors of the Alliance for Refugee Youth Support and Education and several advisory boards, as well as committees to share her broad expertise in the field of language accessibility. Mary Jane studied public service at the University of Pittsburgh and language translation and interpretation at the Universidad. I'm terrible at Spanish. I'm so sorry. I'm going to butcher this. In Mexico City, she brings 20 years of field experience as a translator, interpreter, language accessibility advocate, and consultant to her roles. She is driven and passionate and has dedicated her career to advancing a culture of equitable accessibility for all. So I'm so sorry I butchered the name of the university, but Mary Jane, I will kick things over to you, and the floor is yours.
No problem. Thank you so much, everybody. It's great to be here. Good morning. I do have an interactive discussion coming up in about 5 minutes that I think you'll all really enjoy. And then if there's time toward the end of the presentation, I also have a little activity. So if you have a pen and paper handy, please get that ready now. And without further ado, I'm going to hop into the presentation. And what we're talking about today is language access. I've been doing language access in some form or another for a little over 20 years now. First as a language interpreter myself and a translator, and I founded my organization because I was interpreting in the field and just really kind of sick of the families and individuals that I worked with not being able to, talk to their parents' teachers, not being able to make appointments at doctor's offices, not being able to understand the information when they were at the doctor's office. And when I first started doing this work, I would just kind of yell at people and say, you have to provide language assistance. This is the law. This is what you have to do. But I really quickly realized that people don't actually want to be yelled at. They want to be given tools and information. And also, in most cases, people weren't kind of not doing language access because they didn't want to. It's just that they didn't have the tools and information to do it effectively. So my organization exists to provide direct service and also to give people and share with people tools and information so that they can also make their services, resources, and information available to people who do not communicate in English. And language access is really kind of a field that is just emerging in the last 10 years or so, as we've seen really an increased need for accessibility services to people who don't communicate in English. So today we only have about 25 minutes. So I'm going to be very brief, but there's tons of information out there. There's lots to learn about this topic. And today we're going to focus on just, understanding what language access is and why it's important, right? What it means to people in their everyday lives. And then identifying some resources that you can all use to provide services, resources, and information equitably to people who don't communicate in English. So jumping right in, I already kind of introduced my company and my organization a little bit. We do some social impact work, really just hyper-focused on language accessibility, because language accessibility is kind of our superpower. And this is a picture of us here with some of our local interpreters at our appreciation picnic for our linguists last year in Highland Park. Most of our interpreters are local. We're all over the hospitals, school districts. We work with tons of nonprofits. And it's really a pleasure to be able to do this work to slowly kind of move the needle and make sure that our region itself is more accessible to our immigrant, refugee, and migrant community members. So to start with our topic of just kind of what is language access, this is sort of a mystery to some people, and some of you might have more experience than others with language access, but there are lots of different definitions, right? Because language access means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There's kind of the boring procedural definition, which I have up here in the slide, which is that language access is what is achieved when individuals with limited English proficiency can communicate effectively with your program staff and participate in your programs and activities. So this is the definition that is still for now up on the Department of Justice's website. And you see this term limited English proficient. I do just want to kind of throw it out there that this is kind of, I like to use a more asset-based way to talk about people, right? Because this is kind of a term that focuses on a deficiency, right, or a limitation, and talking about people in terms of, being limited, I think can kind of create an unconscious bias. It is, however, a legal and procedural term, so there's definitely a place for it in the narrative, but I think just being aware of how we talk about people matters, especially when we're talking about language. So I just wanted to point that out. You'll hear me say LEP, limited English proficient, and also I like to just say people who don't communicate in English interchangeably. And there's no real consensus on what a better term or what the best term is. So like I said, I just kind of wanted to put that out there. But, from a procedural standpoint, language access just means making your services, resources, and information available to people who don't communicate in English. And it's more complex than one would think. And it's something that, tends to be an afterthought, I think, for many, not because anybody wants to be discriminatory or because anybody wants to be inequitable, simply because most people don't understand how impactful language access really is. And so for me, the definition that is much more interesting about what is language access is what this means for people, right? Language access is access, full stop, right? Without language, we can't navigate the world. Without language, we can't access services in an equitable way. So I want to do a little group discussion just to kind of really orient you all to what language access is and why it's so important, right? So the first thing I'm going to ask is, when do you all think that we need language, right? So you can put it in the chat or you can just kind of shout out in your daily lives, right? In all of our daily lives, what are some situations, resources, information, and services that require the use of language? What do you all think?
If you're having a argument with your partner or
Yeah,
disagreement.
so communicating with just are the people in our lives, right? Yeah, talking to people.
Actually, in all aspects of how we engage with anyone should be in language. So it's whether sign language, verbal, all kind of communication styles require us to engage with language
Absolutely.
of some type. So
Absolutely. And what about services, right? Healthcare, financial services, housing, food security, right? When do you need language out in the world every day?
all the time.
All the time. So what are some specific examples? If you want to make an appointment with your doctor, you need language, right?
Correct.
If
Or
you
at least
want
an
to,
interpreter.
yeah, if you want to go to the doctor and understand the doctor, you need language. What else?
When you're booking a service or reading out information
Oh,
regarding
great.
the service as well.
Yeah, and here I'm seeing in the chat, thanks. I hadn't looked at this before. Accessing healthcare, riding the bus, going to the bank. These are great. Getting access to resources. We need language to dream and envision internally and externally. Voting, 100% yes. Applying for a job, finding a food pantry, personal and professional protection, driving. These are great. Yeah, so I'm gonna just hop to a little slide here with just a very, very, very few examples, right? This is like the tip of the iceberg slide that you see in a lot of trainings. We need language for financial services, right? And it's not just a broad category. It's getting a bank account, understanding the difference between checking and savings, understanding monthly minimum balances, understanding overdraft fees, libraries and cultural institutions, right? Parks, because language access shouldn't just be about survival. It should also be about enjoying the cultural institutions and resources that we have. Professional services of any kind, right? Being able to join webinars like this, right? Systems navigation, just understanding the way things work broadly, everyday communication, shopping, meeting your basic needs, understanding any kind of press releases, government announcements, emergency management information, public health information, mental health services. This is huge. Public safety, right? So being able to report crime, being able to utilize the justice system, being able to contact public safety officers if needed, housing, right? This is access to mortgages, access to finance, being able to find and rent an apartment, being able to understand your lease, being able to communicate with your landlord, being able to report a broken window or a broken furnace to your landlord, emergency health care, maternal health care. We see a lot of women who are in their 8th month of pregnancy just going to the doctor for the first time because language has been such a barrier. Preventative health care, we also see much higher rates of preventable illness, cervical cancer, things like this, breast cancer, in people who don't communicate in English. Education, right? That's higher education, enrollment, talking to your kids' teachers, understanding truancy laws, reading your kids' report card, public utilities, getting utilities, putting them in your name, understanding the bills, right? Being able to apply for programs like LIHEAP to reduce costs, utilizing public transportation, especially in the climate of routes changing, being able to understand when your routes change, applying for any kind of public benefit, utilizing public benefits, social services, any kind of resources and connections, scheduling anything. I mean, that's like a nightmare, even for those of us who do communicate in English, I think. Understanding community norms, law enforcement, driver's licensing, home ownership, and the list just goes on and on and on and on and on, right? So we need language for everything. And I think there's a kind of a misconception that tools like Google Translate or bilingual helpers like family members and friends are going to help the more than 35,000 people who live in Allegheny County be able to navigate all of these systems all the times. And in some cases, that's true, right? But when we think about the broader scope of making systems and resources and information equitably accessible to people and the impact that that has in our lives, the story goes a lot deeper, right? And so I like to start this conversation with the idea that everyone deserves to be understood, and not just understood, but to have equitable access, right? And I use this term a lot, equitable access, because equity really is important here. And so I'm gonna stop the share for just a minute here and engage you guys in a conversation. For those of you who can and want to come on camera, please do, because I want to sort of talk about now in our lives, if we've had times, or if you have had times when you didn't feel like you had a voice, or you didn't feel like you were understood, and what that's felt like. So I want to focus on feelings. And so I'm going to share just a quick story. It's a silly story. It's kind of funny. But if any of you have stories to share, I would love to get just one or two brief, under 1 minute, just because of time constraints, of a time in your life when you didn't feel like you had a voice and how that made you feel, right? Focusing on those feelings specifically. So an example for me, and it could be anything, right? It could be, being in another country and being lost and being scared, and scared is the feeling, or helpless is the feeling. Or it could be like when I tell my kids to put their shoes on in the morning, it's like they don't even hear me. And I get so frustrated, I want to scream. And then frustrated is the feeling, right? An example I like to use is just silly. When I first moved to Mexico City, 25 years ago, my Spanish was terrible, and I was at a party, and everybody in Mexico City is impossibly hip and cool. And I was like, this awkward girl from the United States, and my Spanish was terrible, and I was embarrassed. So I was walking around this party trying to tell everybody that I was embarrassed, and I kept using the word embarazada, which, for those of you who speak Spanish, would know it's a false cognate. It does not actually mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. So I was walking around thinking I was telling people I was embarrassed, but I was really saying, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant to everybody. I'm drinking beer and whatever. And people are like, okay, lady, you do you. And I couldn't figure out what was going on until somebody finally said, that doesn't actually mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. And I was able to laugh at myself, and everybody thought it was really funny. But under that kind of self-deprecating laughter, I felt stupid, right? I felt ashamed. I felt like I had no business being there. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I wanted to go home. I wanted to go back to my little apartment and hide under a blanket. I felt like an idiot, right? So all of those feelings are really powerful. Shame, embarrassment, exposure, vulnerability, wanting to run away, wanting to hide, right? And I was there by choice. I had financial resources. I had a support network, right? So if any of you have instances, and it could be something funny, it could be something scary, and have a 1 minute top story plus those feelings that you could share with this discussion, I think it would really help us to kind of understand more broadly what language access is in terms of, some of the below surface level stuff. Does anybody want to share a quick story?
I'll share a story. I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for or not, but whenever you were talking about your story, it made me think of my story. So I went to a funeral one time, and it's the funeral home is never a very comfortable position kind of thing to be in, like you don't know what to say and so on. And I tend to use humor a lot just in my daily life, which obviously doesn't always match up, in a funeral home and so on. So I get a little nervous just even, having to go into that situation. Well, it was my mom's friend's husband that passed away. And my mom's friend was there, and whenever I came up, she was like, "Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it." And I just came back with, "Thank you so much for having me," as if she invited me to a party and I showed up. So I know it wasn't the worst thing that I could say, but it really wasn't appropriate for the time. And I just felt like I wanted to crawl out of there. There was nothing I could say after that. I didn't want to make light of it. She didn't say anything, but it did make me feel very, I don't know, just uncomfortable after I said that.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and uncomfortable is a really powerful feeling too.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I'm sure she understood for what it's
I'm
worth.
sure.
But yeah, that's a great example. And those feelings are real. And even though it's English to English, it's still like a cultural miscommunication, which is a big part of language access over also. There's somebody in the chat generally visiting the doctor's office and having more chronic issues that are not acute enough to warrant immediate attention, but inevitably make life much more difficult. Absolutely. I've suffered from chronic fatigue, migraines, and anxiety headaches, but many symptoms are hard to describe, and the doctors sometimes will say it's in your head. Most certainly it is not. Thank you for sharing that. I very much relate, and I'm sorry that you have to go through that. Being kind of, I guess, patronized or written off or not listened to is a horrible feeling and definitely a part of this. So I'm going to write down not listened to, and difficult, you wrote in there, is also a very powerful feeling. And, just in the interest of time, just with these two, gaslit, absolutely, that's huge. I'm going to point out that just during this very brief discussion, the feelings that I've kind of extracted from what I said, what was shared by Michelle and Kira, by Daniel in the chat, are ashamed or shame, fear, stupidity, embarrassment, frustrated, stupid, like an idiot, wanted to go home, uncomfortable, don't know what to say, not appropriate, wanted to crawl away, uncomfortable, not listened to, difficult, and gaslit, right? So those are just a few small instances. And thank you for your participation, everybody. I'm going to hop back into my slides now and go just to this list that I've kind of pre-made here of some other ones that people have shared when I've done this exercise over the years. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We have fear, isolation, anger, dehumanization, stupid, ashamed, embarrassed, frustrated, alone, stigmatized, less than, other, anxiety, depression, lost, self-conscious, misunderstood, worried, unwelcome, unwanted, belittled, incapable, resigned or resignation, withdrawn, exhausted, hard, hopeless, powerless, invisible, and unworthy. And these are things that real people have shared over the years. And so I like to pull that together by going back to, when we talk about what is language access and putting these kind of two lists together, right? When we look at some, just the tip of the iceberg of the various systems, resources, parts of information that we need to navigate the world, and some, just the tip of the iceberg of the feelings that people can feel when they're disenfranchised by language or a lack thereof, or a lack of language access. And it's pretty powerful now to think about what language access is then, because what do you all think happens when people feel any combination of these feelings every time they try to interact with any of these systems? It's not rhetorical. What do you guys think? What do you guys think is the result? I'll share it with you. It is that people stop showing up for services. People stop soliciting services. People stop engaging. People stop trying. And so this is part of why people do not think of our region as diverse. There are more than 75 languages represented in Pittsburgh Public Schools. We have a very diverse region, right? Close to 1 in 5 people speaks a language other than English in the home in Allegheny County. And of those, about a third identify as having limited English proficiency. So there are thousands and thousands of people in this region who aren't showing up in the census data, aren't showing up for services. And much of this is because when people constantly have to feel some of these feelings or try to access services and not be able to, they get tired, they shut down, they stop trying, right? And I think it can be a little bit reductive to think of immigrants, migrants, and refugees only as people who are suffering or who don't have access or who can't access services, right? And that's certainly not the case. We're talking about capable human beings who are just tired, I think, and who deserve and who are entitled to legally and ethically equal access to resources, information, and services. But for various reasons, that's not always happening, right? And part of it is that language access is new for many of us. And part of it is that we haven't really built out the infrastructure to support language access. And so that's kind of my job. And that's what a lot of the trainings that I do exist to provide with people. And so I'm going to jump in now to some practical stuff just for 5 or 6 minutes to give you guys some tools to help solve this problem, right? And of course, it's much bigger than what we can do in a 25-minute session. And there's so much more information to share. But just giving you guys the basics will give you some confidence, right? It'll give you some tools and some resources that you can use if you're ever in a situation where somebody doesn't communicate in English and you want to help or you want to provide services to them. And I think that when we have tools and information, we're much more likely than to act. And I always tell people in terms of language access, it's always going to feel awkward the first time you work with an interpreter. It's always going to be difficult at first, but it's like riding a bike. And the more you do it, the more comfortable it will feel. And you just have to kind of start where you are. So the very, very starting place for me is sharing just, what a few resources are. So there is what we call on-demand phone interpretation. And this would be when you pick up the phone and you put in a code and you get a live interpreter on the other end. There's on-demand video remote interpretation, which is the same thing, which is where you get a video interpreter. There's pre-scheduled on-site and video interpretation. And this would be when you know in advance, such as for a doctor's appointment, that you have a patient coming in who doesn't communicate in English, and you're able to pre-schedule an interpreter. And this is always the best option when it's available, because there are a lot of problems with quality for on-demand stuff, and we'll talk about that briefly in a moment. Written translation is another language assistance resource, and then using tools that are like AI-based tools like ChatGPT, Google Translate, etc. Really quickly, Understanding the difference between translation and interpretation is also important. Translation is written transfer of language from one language to another. Translation, you can use things like dictionaries to supplement your own fluency, but then interpretation is oral or signed interpretation. And this requires a high level of fluency and lots of trainings because it's real time. And you need to kind of have those language skills handy without being able to consult, online glossaries and things like that necessarily. I want to point out also, I mentioned it briefly before, that we tend to talk about, Google Translate and bilingual helpers as being able to solve a lot of these problems. But the issue with this is that interpretation is like 1% language skill and 99% other skills. Managing the room, understanding how to deflect side conversations, balancing ethical concerns, knowing how to do shorthand and take notes so that you can be accurate and complete, knowing where to position your body, who to speak to, etc. And so when people aren't trained, the communication will not be equitable because they don't have the skills needed to be able to accurately convey the information. They might do things like answering questions on behalf of the subject rather than interpreting the question, and that actually disenfranchises people and takes agency away from people. They might do things like misunderstand the information. They might summarize. They might pick and choose what information is important, and that's not equity, right? So I like to put that out there because really it's up to us as service providers and advocates to provide professional interpretation services, right? I don't conflate language fluency with physical or cognitive disability, but as a member of the disability community myself, I often feel comfortable saying this is a lot like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was not implemented until 1991. And at the time, we were having conversations about why things like wheelchair accessibility were needed. Right? It's difficult to implement the infrastructure for this, but it's very much necessary. And just like you wouldn't put like plywood over a staircase and call it a wheelchair ramp, you also shouldn't just kind of like use Google Translate and assume that it's sufficient for somebody to be able to equitably understand the information or communicate. And so as service providers, as advocates, it's really our responsibility to kind of get in there and do the right thing, get an interpreter. And it's really uncomfortable to do that for the first time if you've never done it before. So I wanted to leave you with some practical tools for how to work with interpreters. And these are some things, again, that trained interpreters will know how to do. And that is that when you work with an interpreter, for example, you want to speak to the subject directly and not to the interpreter. So you don't look at the interpreter and say, please tell him that I said hello. You would just look right at the person and say hello, and the interpreter will handle the rest. You always want to use first person speech, right? So again, you don't want to say, she sells seashells by the seashore. You would just say, Sally sells seashells by the seashore, or I sell seashells by the seashore, because then people don't get confused about who's doing what. And it's very clear always who's speaking and what the information is. You want to always allow extra time if you're using interpretation, up to double, right? Because it does take time to do an interpretation session. And then you want to pause after each sentence to allow the subject to process and respond to the information. You want to ask one question at a time. Make sure that, interpreters should never answer questions on behalf of the subject, right? So make sure if you're working with an interpreter that, you're keeping an eye out to make sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing. And then also yourself, simplify your questions, simplify your language, avoid things like acronyms. And this will all just make things go much more smoothly. So there are also some things to consider when working with AI. Oops, sorry. And that is that AI is a wonderful tool if you're using it for written communication, but there are still serious issues. And just like you see AI videos that are super weird or AI images that are super weird, translations that are done using AI also can get pretty weird, right? And so some of the issues to look out for are that data privacy and security are a big problem, right? Any of the public tools that you're going to use, and even the ones that maybe you have a paid subscription to, will be harvesting the data. So there's no HIPAA compliance, or they're not FERPA compliant and things like that. The quality is very dependent on the language pair. Right? There's more research and development for what we call high resource languages like Spanish or Chinese than for things even like Vietnamese or Kinyarwanda, some of the other ones. So the quality is vastly different. There's still lots of hallucinations and errors. Human intervention is still needed for error recognition and correction. And AI doesn't handle any of the project management tasks, right? So somebody still has to copy and paste the text. Somebody still has to make sure that it aligns. If you're doing a right to left language, often AI will just right justify it rather than actually flipping the text, right? So you have to kind of keep some of those design and layout features in mind also. And then there are a lot of issues with bias and representation, right? So those are kind of some of the other really practical tips for language access that I can share with you in this short period of time. And then the last thing I want to share with you before we go to questions is that if you are working in an organization that serves the public, some things that you can do to incorporate language access and build institutional fluency, build infrastructure within your organization for this, are to just make language access a part of the regular narrative and get buy-in from other folks within your organization. Designate a line item in your budget, right? Because language access will always be an afterthought if there's no money for it. Setting up an agreement with a language services provider, providing training to your staff, how to work with interpreters, why it's important, what the best practices are, etc. Provide notice to your clients or to the people you serve that language services are available. And then make sure that you have your vital materials translated in advance so that if somebody does walk in the door and needs to fill out your intake form, it's in the language already and you're not kind of scrambling to figure out what to do. So again, there's so much more I could talk about language access. I'm obviously very passionate about this. I have a big soapbox that I could spend many hours on, but I know that we also need to spend some time addressing any questions that you all might have. And I believe that Brianna also has some announcements to make at the end of today's call. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important work, and I am happy to answer any questions that you have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary Jane. I really appreciate the kind of bigger picture. I know when we talk about language access, it could get a little overwhelming for folks. So I appreciate the kind of the parsing out of just kind of the little steps we can take, and then the bigger picture kind of overview of everything when it comes to language access. If you have any questions, please feel free to come off mute and drop them in the chat. There was a question that came through. Someone asked, are there any training services that Global Wordsmiths provides on an organizational level where you could help identify spots where they could better use implement language accessibility across the organizational resources?
Yeah, this is a huge part of what we do. We train, we do consulting, we work with individuals to try to help build infrastructure and figure out the best solution. But definitely we do a lot of trainings, and we'll have some free trainings coming up in the fall. So keep an eye out for those, where we'll be doing kind of like a longer version of this training with more practical skills. That's about an hour long, free to anybody that wants to join.
There was a
I'm sorry. Yes, I see one here in the chat. Do we offer ASL services? We do. However, it's not kind of like our main cup of tea. We are not members of the deaf community, and we don't want to claim to represent the deaf community. So we do have a few sign language interpreters, but we usually refer people out to partners for ASL for anything that's, more than just like a casual assignment here and there.
had a quick question.
Sure.
There's a company that I'm working with, and they have safety training and testing requirements. And at a recent hiring event, a group of immigrants applied for many of the positions. And there's language barriers and concerns there. And I was wondering if there's a group that has resources that would translate some of the training material into another language.
Yeah, so I think, there are a couple ways to do that. One is to just, you pay a language services provider to do the translation. I don't recommend volunteer translation. I'm an adjunct professor of applied translation at Carnegie Mellon University, and I can say that even after a year and a half in our master's program, these very talented students still have red ink all over all their translations because translation is just really complex as a task. So the best way to do it, especially if safety is involved, is to pay professional translators. And this would be the responsibility, I think, under OSHA regulations for whatever the partner organization is that is kind of providing that information to the group. I hope that answers your question. And another more cost-effective way would be to use something like AI translation, but then make sure that you have a human proofreader go through and make sure that it's all correct.
Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you for mentioning like bringing AI to this topic, because I think it just seeing kind of where technology sits currently and kind of the trajectory of AI is important in making sure, like, again, it's accessible but also correct in terms of making sure like the communication and things of that nature are like AI is a good starting point, but obviously, like you said, like bringing the human in to make sure that the starting point is checks off all the boxes. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the table in this conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful tool, but it should be used appropriately. And especially for those lower resource languages. I don't like that term, but that's kind of the technical term that's being used. There's a tipping point when it's more work to proofread a bad AI translation than it is to translate from scratch. And so it depends on the platform, and it depends on the language, and it depends on the context, and it depends on the source text. But a professional can help you figure out where that threshold is.
Yeah, and actually, just to continue on that, one thing that I noticed, because I'm from Germany, I'm coming here via Germany, and one of the things that's interesting is the turn-by-turn directions are different in German than they are that you get less information than you do in English, which is really interesting. I have on my phone, if I have my directions in English, I will get in 600 meters turn right onto Main Street, and when I get in German is turn right.
Right. Yeah.
Which is and it's the same thing, because those lower resource. I mean, German's not a low resource language, but still, it's so difficult to translate all these things that even with technical aids, the technical aids that you might be investing in might not be good enough. Might not serve people well. You still create those inadequacies, the inequities.
And one note about many European languages, including German, is that they're considered low resource for the purposes of like training AI, because low resource isn't necessarily how many people speak the language or how prominent it is. It's how much research and development dollars or how much money is going into training the systems and how much data there is. And because there's such a high level of English in Germany, there's not as much R&D money going into training systems between these two languages. So the output is going to be a lot different from, the languages where lots of financial resources are going into it.
Well, again, Mary, thank you so much for being able to jump on the call today and share all these resources and have this conversation, because it, especially, given the current climate of the world, I think it's important to, again, just continue to make sure that not only resources are available, but providing kind of safe spaces to have these conversations. So thank you again for helping us kickstart our morning in a thoughtful way.
Pleasure. And thank you all so much for participating in the conversation and just for being interested in being here.
For anybody, I don't know, Mary Jane, if you feel comfortable sharing your contact information, but if there were any follow-up questions, or if there was a copy of the slide deck we could provide for folks, might be helpful. But then this is also recorded, and we'll have it up on the Forbes Fund's YouTube channel by the end of the week. And it'll be in our newsletter and on the GPMP member portal for accessibility purposes. But with that, I know we have just a couple more minutes left. I'm going to launch our poll for the call. Just helps gather a little bit of data on kind of where folks want to see these calls going, if there's any topics or speakers that you want to hear from, or hear more about, any resources that are critical to the sector. And while the poll is going, I'm going to kick things over to Craig to give the GPNP policy update really quickly. So give me 1 second. I'll launch the poll and then I'll pull up the screen and we can jump into policy stuff. Sorry.
All right, so thanks, Bree. All right, so what I want to do is walk you through the three really big things that have been going on over the past week. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty around all these things. They're still in process. They're still taking shape. I want to keep you up to date on the three big issues. One is this, we see right there is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, this new budget resolution that's coming through. And the next one is going to be birthright citizenship, and the other one is the NORA, or this House rule, this about rulings and so forth. So what this is the budget package that's central to President Trump's agenda. And last night it squeaked through the House Budget Committee after 4 of the more conservative members of the committee decided to vote present and allowed to go through. This is a significant bill. There's lots of things that are going on here. One thing that they're doing is, as you see there, it's they're making the 2017 tax cuts permanent, and they're also cutting or eliminating taxes on tips and overtime pay and those types of things. But then to pay for that, the budget includes cuts to lots of safety net programs, cuts to Medicaid, to SNAP, also cuts to green energy initiatives. And while it's increasing defense and border spending, and then there are also other types of things that are going in terms of state and local tax deductions and those types of things. But what's happening there too is you have those sorts of microeconomic issues, but the thing that's really big here as well is the increasing of the national debt and the risk that poses to the overall economy. If you can go to the next slide there, Bree. There you go. And so basically, the big thing that we could be thinking about here is Medicaid. So they're talking about increasing work requirements, but also coverage reductions, and which can also be very challenging. They're saying here that projecting that 8.6 million people could lose Medicaid coverage by 2034. And in addition, they're looking at how this is going to roll down into the states, having to make adjustments within their budgets, putting pressure on other aspects of their budgets to pay for these Medicaid adjustments. This is a very complicated, complex situation that we really don't know what things are going to look like what the final bill is going to be. But essentially, what's going to be happening is that the process is I think maybe Bree, I think it's on the next page. They're looking at this week. It's going to be going through another committee, and then they're going to be going to a House floor vote, and then and if it passes in the House, it's going to be moving to the Senate. And with the goal of having Trump assign this on July 4th. There's a lot that is really uncertain, as I said before, about this bill. The conservatives are opposing it because it doesn't go far enough. Moderate Republicans are also concerned about the depth and breadth of the cuts, and of course, the Democrats are unanimous in opposing it. And so we don't really know exactly how this is going to all shake out in the end, because the House is going to pass their version, the Senate will pass their version, and then something's going to be happening in terms of the reconciliation between those two versions, and so the time will tell what the bill is going to be looking like. But the question now is, what can we do? And with each one of these areas of this budget proposal, the birthright citizenship and the NORA Act, they're very similar things. But actually, here who's going to be affected? Adults in low-wage jobs, people in rural areas. A lot of people are going to be affected in this, and this is going to be affecting a lot of different aspects of the economy, particularly nonprofits who are going to be depending on Medicaid reimbursements, but also thinking about lots of effects in terms of green energy, in terms of other types of nonprofits who might be squeezed in other areas. So this is a very complicated bill. And what's the next slide there, Bree? And really, these are the things that we really need to be doing. Getting informed ourselves, educating people, educating your stakeholders, strengthening networks, and beginning to advocate, and also beginning to prepare strategically throughout your operations in terms of how potential cuts could affect you, in terms of increasing demand for services, all these things. This is something we need to be watchful of. Let's go on to birthright citizenship. This is also something that comes out of the early days of the Trump administration, where he signed an order essentially removing birthright citizenship, which basically what that means is it denies automatic U.S. citizenship to children born on U.S. soil unless at least one parent is a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And with that of course contradicts the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. There have been legal challenges to this, and what came up to the Supreme Court last week was the question. It was essentially two different things that the justices were considering. One was whether the injunctions that were imposed by district courts were valid nationally. That was the main question on the table. But then in the background there was the question of whether this particular executive order was constitutional. And again, we don't know where this is going to fall. It looks like there's the question of whether or not the executive order will. It seems like the judges were inclined to overrule to uphold the lower order, essentially overruling the executive order. But the question is how narrow, how broad that finding will be, their judgment will be. So we're trying to figure that out. And again, the impact of this, if this were to go through, if it's upheld, could be significant to children born to undocumented immigrants. Essentially, lots of children, and I think 150,000 kids would be affected by this, and part of the challenge here is that it's really uncertain what would happen and what hospitals would do, what state and local governments would be able to would do. All these things of just managing this. It's a very uncertain question here, and again, what can we do with this is educating, advocating, preparing for legal support, and just because again, you could be seeing lots of increased demand for services and so forth, and just monitoring developments and staying tuned to what's going on. And then the final one is this HR 1526, or what's called the NORA, or No Rogue Rulings Act. And essentially, this is about injunctions in general. So this question about legal orders by district courts, how much how broadly do they can they be affecting the nationwide? So the way it is right now is a federal district court judge can make a ruling, and then that in one district, and then have that be valid for the entire country. This particular resolution is a bill is trying to narrow that significantly, and so basically it's stopping policies from being or district courts rulings from being nationwide. It's putting limits on injunctions, with some other types of procedural changes where they are it's things like class action lawsuits, or situations where multiple states might be coming forward with lawsuits, and bringing that forward. They're creating process for that, but it's going to make things much more cumbersome. And that, I think that's and what's there at the bottom of the screen there. The challenge here is that these rulings have been vital tools for nonprofit and legal advocacy partners, in terms of helping to affect change and to stop problematic legislation from taking hold. And they're looking at removing that tool, and this could have implications on a whole host of areas in terms of civil rights, environmental justice, immigration, healthcare, economic equity, and again, educating, advocating, and preparing strategically for this is going to be really important. So with that, I guess we also want to talk about, there's a National Council on Nonprofits with some links. And I don't know, Bree, how we want to give these, but there's the Democracy Protection Network, there's the Democracy Security Project, Beacon, Access Now. There are a variety of resources that have been named that could be helpful for you in your policy monitoring efforts. They're there, and then other types of other resources that could be just as important there, through the National Council on Nonprofits. Okay.
And if folks want to stay on for just a couple minutes, I can copy and paste these in the chat to make sure you have access to them. And they'll also be in the GPNP portal and the newsletter going out later this week. But thank you so much, Craig. Again, I know we're at time. Just really quickly to recap, Dan from Involvement was on earlier to plug the Solar Punk Future event that's happening in 10 days. Registration at the QR code, or again, I can drop the link in the chat again. And then happening on Thursday, June 26th, save the date, TFF and GPNP at First Tee are hosting a golf event, Transformative Tee Off. It's a chance to kind of network and mingle, grab some food and some drink, and use the Arnold Palmer golf course at First Tee, as well as the golf simulators. You can bring your own clubs can be provided, but tickets will be on sale later this week, so just keep an eye out for that. But thank you so much for spending your morning with us. We really appreciate it. There will be no call next week, as it is Memorial Day. So hope folks get a chance to kind of take a break and just reset for kickoff for summer. So again, if everyone wants to hang on just a second, I can copy those resources into the chat here. But again, thank you so much for your time, and I hope everyone has a great week. Thank you so much.